Good morning. Wahoo wah. Anyone going to the game this morning? Because it's a noon game, bright and early. I saw a few hands. Please bring home a win. Go Who's. I'm Althea Brooks, and I'm Senior Director of Lifetime Learning in the Office of Engagement. It's so good to see you all out this morning on this beautiful fall morning. Welcome to our in-person, and then also welcome to those online. We have quite a few who joined us live stream this morning, so thank you for being here. We've got some Batten Board of Directors here. Welcome. We're glad to see you as well. We have 4 more great lectures. I hope you're signed up for them all. The next one, if you're not already signed up for the in-person, go ahead and just register for online because we've reached capacity. We'd love to see you on October 29th. Also learn about other lifetime learning programs at engagement.virginia.edu. And we're thrilled to welcome Ian Solomon. He is the Dean and Professor of Practice at the Frank Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy. Dean Solomon will be speaking with us today about how to cultivate leaders to serve the greater good. I'm going to introduce him by asking him a few questions. Come on up, Dean Solomon. Go ahead and give him a warm More Than Score welcome.
Fantastic. Good morning.
Excellent. Thank you for being here at More Than Score this morning.
Thank you, Althea, for organizing this. Although I must say, Larry Sabato's getting a full crowd. Come on, guys. I want some energy out there.
You know, he has a reputation. Anyway, all right, so here are a few questions. So you're a member of the Council of Foreign Relations and have traveled and worked extensively in Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America, and many other places. So Dean Solomon, tell us briefly how the work you've done on the council and your work in these foreign countries has helped prepare you for your role as Dean at the Batten School.
Thank you, Althea, and good morning, everybody. I feel very loud, but hopefully that's okay. If I start to shout, just go like this and I'll whisper. But it's great to be here, and I appreciate the question, particularly someone who used to travel all the time and now actually travel very little thanks to COVID, but hopefully we get back on the road soon. Because one of the things I take from that work was the importance of a global perspective. Right? We like to think that everything happens here. We are 5% of the world. It's a big world out there. Lots of people, lots of ideas, lots of challenges. So one of the things that come to me from that work is just always trying to remember 95% of the population that's not within US borders. Also, I think a level of just an appreciation for our common humanity, right? I've been to 40 some odd countries, and secret, people are people. And we're all complicated, and we're all problematic, and we're all relatable and care about connection. And I guess the third thing is, you asked about travel. My first trip, my first passport actually was for a trip to South Africa that I did as an undergraduate student. Ended up staying for the year leading up to the election of Mandela and watching the negotiations to reconcile that country after apartheid continues to be a major motivator for me, and I'll talk about that a bit today. Because to me, that is the greater good, thinking about how do we bring people who are torn apart and bring them together.
Thank you. Such a great answer. Okay, so here's another one. But let me tell you a little bit about his background. Now that's loud. He's from New York City. He earned his BA from Harvard University and his JD from Yale Law School. He's worked as Associate Dean and Visiting Lecturer at Yale Law and Vice President and Lecturer in Law at the University of Chicago. So here's your question. How long have you been at UVA, and how do the cultures and academics of these other institutions compare to UVA?
So I started here. Sounds are bouncing off of walls. I started here, and the football game hasn't even started yet. Started September 2019, so I'm now in my 4th year here at UVA. and I've benefited from many excellent and expensive institutions. And I will say a couple things about UVA. One is, and I've actually talked about this with other people who I've gone to school with, there's a tremendous joy and passion and humanity at UVA, and that really struck me. The other thing I'd say is that, you know, and this is my experiences most closely within the Batten School, I've never seen another institution take education and the teaching of students as seriously as we do.
A wahoo-wah, right? All right, I have one more question for you. So I understand that you reside on the lawn. You're a lawnie.
Which a Bradshaw's, actually, it seems. But,
which pavilion do you reside, and can you tell us a little bit about the history of this pavilion and how you've highlighted that history for those that lived and worked there?
Great, thank you, Althea. I live in Pavilion 10 on the lawn on the east side, furthest from the rotunda, has the green shutters. Last night, there was a very loud party going very late. One of the joys of living on the lawn. And there's a lot of history in Pavilion 10. So if you've walked past, you see the plaque on the ground about starting the honor code in 1842. Well, that was because the pavilion resident, John Davis, was shot by students fighting. People used to walk around with guns and stuff around here, very dangerous. Happily, hopefully, residents of pavilions are now safer. And there is a lot of history in Pavilion 10. In fact, I have an exhibit in the basement that talks about some of the people who were both enslaved and worked there and enslaved others and lived there, including an exhibit about Fanny Gillette Hearn, who had been Jefferson's chef in the White House. He took his enslaved worker back to Monticello, and she was sold at an estate sale after Jefferson died, purchased by Robley Dungleson, who was the first resident of the pavilion, lived there for 8 years, to be his chef inside Pavilion 10. John Minor, big name around town, lived in the Pavilion 10 for 50 years, 1845 to 1895, so through the Civil War. After him, his great-nephew, William Minor Lyle, was there for another 40 years. A lot of history. Some of it quite troubling and problematic and requiring our hard work to overcome. But we'll get to that too.
Thank you so much. Please help me welcome Dean Solomon to More Than Sport.
Thank you, Althea. Well, thank you, Althea. Thank you all for joining this morning. It is great to see you. And I want to thank, where's Rob? Rob somewhere? Rob, to blame or to credit for my great UVA socks. For those of you who know me, I am a very boring sock person, but I almost wish I could stick my legs out to show you. It is really my honor to join More Than the Score and so many UVA alumni and friends, both here and also on the live stream. So I'll wave to live stream folks. Thank you for joining. It really is my delight to be with you. This year, the Batten School is celebrating our 15th anniversary, which is really young for UVA. But we've had a great 15 years. And for those who've been away from UVA for a while, the Batten School is in Garrett Hall, right at the top of the amphitheater. We're raising funds for a second facility on the Emmett Ivy Corridor because we have long outgrown this building. And our focus on the integration of leadership and policy makes us unlike any other school in the world. And I'll talk about that today. We chose this title, Serving the Greater Good, because that is the ambition of the Batten School. And our mission is simple, yet profound. We serve the greater good by 1, developing outstanding leaders, 2, creating new knowledge to solve our toughest public policy challenges, and 3, engaging with the public to put this knowledge into action. And we do this in a unique and compelling way. So I'll make a few remarks up front, but I do want to get to Q&A and hear what's on your mind. Now, have you noticed that so many people seem stressed out, exhausted, maybe even depressed these days? Maybe you do too. You're still struggling with this pandemic or post-pandemic or pandemic phase 2 malaise, even as we get back to normal-ish. And it's so great to see you here and see your smiling faces without your masks, and welcome those with your masks. Keep them on, stay safe. Maybe I should wear one too. But I suspect one reason for this anxiety is concern about the threats we face right now. Right? One threat is global conflict, exemplified by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The risk of dangerous escalation seems greater than the probability of peace right now. Another threat is the breakdown of democratic culture and institutions. Feeding and fueling that threat is a cancer of political polarization and toxic tribalism, political opponents presented as enemies, and traditional enemies embraced as friends. There's enormous anxiety about government failure to provide basic public services in the forms of education, and around here you can't even get buses to take your kids to school right now. Or health, or public safety. Other challenges also demoralizing, such as declining life expectancy, food insecurity, persistent racial inequality, economic dislocation and poverty. How about the dangers posed by climate change? And the perception that we are running out of time to take meaningful action. So I don't bring up these challenges to ruin your Saturday. It is important that we do not let ourselves get overwhelmed or paralyzed by fear. It's much more constructive to focus on solutions and actions that we can take. And to remind ourselves that this country has faced existential threats before. Global conflict today is not as grave a threat as it was in World War II or the Cold War. Political polarization has been much, much worse before. And our democracy has proved resilient. And for all the cynicism and all the noise out there and concern about our institutions, they remain, in many cases, vibrant and hopeful. The recent Batten graduation. Nevertheless, there are aspects of our insecurity that we must address. We are confronted with urgent, complex problems of human social organization, trust, and cooperation, and together these problems threaten enormous suffering and are actually epic challenges for our democracy and our society. And to solve these problems, we need new habits of thought and behavior. Well, changing habits of thought and behavior is the work of leadership. And the words of our founder for the Batten School, the late Frank Batten Sr., are as true today as when he uttered them 15 years ago. He said, "Never has there been a greater need for the university's most important product, enlightened and ethical leaders who leave grounds prepared for public life in their communities, in their professions, in the world at large." Enlightened and ethical leaders prepared for public life. And Frank Batten was keen to emphasize leadership in contrast to management. He believed it was relatively easy to find good managers who could make the proverbial trains run on time, but much more difficult to find leaders who could drive transformational change. And that's what we are about at the Batten School. So let's talk a little about leaders and leadership. You're up early, but we're going to make this a little bit of a class. I might call on you, Joan, or John. Michael, beware. But when you think of a leader in any field, what are some names that come to mind? Shout them out. Think of a leader, shout out some names. Okay, we'll come to traits and ideas, but some names of people. Matthew. Malcolm Brogdon. Malcolm Brogdon, a graduate. Okay, other names. Zelensky, fantastic. Other names of leaders that come to mind. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, excellent. Other leaders? Chris Long, football, yes, fantastic. And Merkel. And Abraham Lincoln. Obama. Martin Luther King, fantastic. Okay, Stacey Abrams, fantastic. No, so that question, excellent. Not necessarily leadership, you don't have to like them. You may not like their politics, but people who represent leadership, people who have disproportionate influence on the thoughts and habits and ideas of Obama, and like some of what he did and don't like other things. But now to get to Michael's point, what are some of the, what about the behavior of Obama characterized effective leadership? Optimism. Authenticity. Communication. Trustworthy. Vision. Role model. Great. Caring. So some of these are perhaps personality traits, right? Some are skills, right? Some may be ethical values. Some might be just natural. He is an optimistic person, right? Just something unique to his personality. Some have to do with circumstance. So someone mentioned Malcolm Brogdon. Karen mentioned Malcolm Brogdon. Joan mentioned Chris Long. Both demonstrated leadership in a very particular circumstance, right? I mean, I don't know how well Chris Long could do Jim Ryan's job as president, right? Might have fantastic leadership skills, but are they appropriate for the task at hand? Maybe, I don't know. And actually, Chris and Malcolm have both Malcolm's still playing for the Celtics now, but they demonstrate leadership through their philanthropy too, not just on the courts. And Malcolm, hopefully inspired by his Batten education, has actually been quite thoughtful about how he wants to make his mark, not just as a player and a role model, but as a philanthropist. And we are very proud of that. The Batten School, we like to say that leaders are made and not born. Right? Now, there are certain traits that may be naturally born, but we believe that everybody's leadership can be improved through training and practice, and that is at the heart of what we do. And I prefer not to characterize leadership as good or bad. I think it's more helpful to think about what is more effective and what may be less effective. And if we're talking about effectiveness, I think we have to ask, effective for what? With whom? How? And under what set of circumstances? Because leadership often depends on the circumstances. Does it depend on your role and your position? What about the type of leadership that has nothing to do with your role, right? Obama was president. Chris Long played football. Malcolm played basketball. What about leaders who exercise leadership without any official position? What are some names that come to mind? Gandhi. Melinda Gates. Mother Teresa. Right, what about, what's that? St. Francis. I think it's really important to think about how people can exercise leadership wherever they are. How about Harriet Tubman, who led 13 missions of the Underground Railroad, rescuing over 70 people? Or here in Charlottesville, Ziana Bryant, UVA student, asking some questions about the statues, leading to them all coming down. What about Mohammed Bouazizi, who set himself on fire in Tunisia and kicked off the Arab Spring? Or thousands of people in homes and communities all around the world that we don't even think about, but who are taking initiative to improve their communities. So we teach that leadership is not dependent on one's role or position. It's taking initiative to shape the future regardless of your role or your status. In fact, one half of the Batten School model is lead from anywhere. We believe that people can exercise leadership from any position or from none at all. Think of Rosa Parks or Greta von Thunberg. The other half of our Batten motto is that policy is everywhere. So perhaps you're wondering, what is this thing called public policy? Don't worry if you don't know, I'm going to tell you. But public policy is the rules, the laws that govern how a society or its institutions allocate rights, responsibilities, resources. And public policy dictates how a public school system educates our children, or how a community handles public safety or sanitation, or how we fund and operate our nation's military. In terms of some of the epic challenges we talked about, public policy might define how we safeguard our electoral processes and voting rights, how we manage public health during a pandemic, what actions we take to mitigate or adapt to the devastations of climate change. But let's think together for a minute about leadership shaping the future in the domains of public policy. And let me ask another question. Who are the people who shape the future of public policy? Who exercises influence over our rights, responsibilities, and resources? Shout out some examples. Corporations. American Petroleum Institute. Supreme Court. Super PACs, congressional leaders. The media. Voters and citizens. Intellectual writers or thought leaders. Anarchists. So what are the skills that make these entities and these people most effective? Are they the same types of skills that we talked about previously on optimism and communication and authenticity? What knowledge makes them effective? What relationships? What types of values? This is what we're about trying to understand at the Batten School. Empowering people with the skills, with the knowledge, with the ethical values for effective public service leadership to influence the shape of public policy for this country and for the world. The Batten hypothesis is that we can cultivate the transformational leadership to serve the greater good. We're the only school that we know of with an explicit focus on both leadership and public policy. Now, there are schools that teach public policy. There are schools that teach leadership. Our secret sauce is the marriage of public policy and leadership to promote the public good. We integrate leadership and policy in our research, in our teaching, and in our public engagement. And we apply the very best in leadership science and pedagogy with the skills of policy analysis. And the results are powerful. Students learn a unique approach to leadership in both theory and practice, and we want them to develop capacity for leadership that is evidence-based, grounded in facts, literate with data, informed by context, non-ideological, deeply rooted in an understanding of human behavior and psychology. And in addition to a unique perspective on leadership, we encourage a unique approach to public policy, an approach to policy that is aligned with what we know about human psychology and relationships, about system social dynamics, stakeholder groups, and factions. Policy that is thoughtful about context and situation, that is implementable, action-oriented, pragmatic, sustainable. And we achieve this leadership and policy integration with an extraordinary faculty that is extraordinary, interdisciplinary. We're applied microeconomists, experimental social psychologists, political scientists, policy scholars with deep subject matter expertise, as well as practitioners and amazing educators who take their teaching incredibly seriously. And we've developed an original curriculum and compelling course offerings, and you can find details on the Batten website if you are interested. Students learn psychological insights about human behavior, about influence and persuasion, motivation, bias. They're introduced to concepts of resilience, the effect of different mindsets, the panoply of cognitive errors that people make in decision making. These are sometimes referred to as the soft skills. I'm not sure why they're soft. Students also learn quantitative problem-solving skills, how to frame questions and define problems, how to collect and analyze information, how to construct alternative solution options, and the evaluative criteria to judge those different alternatives, how to test hypotheses, project outcomes, and how to communicate decisions and recommendations. And they become very familiar, as our MPP student Caitlin can tell you, with research methods, statistics, the tools of economics that are sometimes referred to as the hard skills. And they also study political institutions like Congress, like the role of corporations. I'm not sure we look at the American Petroleum Institute, but perhaps some students will do that as well, to understand different public policy issues. And a Batten education is unique. It's also challenging. Students who are highly quantitative are often made uncomfortable being pushed on more the interpersonal and softer skills, shall we say. Students that are more literary are pushed on the quantitative and analytical work. Staff and faculty are pushed because we're trying to create something novel and useful. And experiential learning and applied practical projects complement our classroom instruction. You can't learn it all in a classroom. You have to get out and do it. But in our classes, we do really interesting things. In one of our classes, for example, students analyze a personal leadership failure, a time when they were unable to motivate the cooperation of others, or perhaps they were unable to analyze a context and created more chaos than change. And we all know the importance of learning from failure, but many people would prefer not to do it. Our students, we don't give them a choice. They develop a case study of their failure, and in some cases it's something went wrong during an internship or previous employment. In one of the cases I recall, it was an unsuccessful effort to establish a new political organization. And they diagnose the situation and the nature of the problem that they faced. They map out the stakeholders and the sources of both formal and informal or positional authority. They analyze the sequence of decisions they made, how they communicated, who they involved as allies. Then they spend time with a classmate peer consultant to dive into the situation, to help think through the case, delve into the difficulties, highlight the lessons from the experience. And in this course, the classroom becomes a learning laboratory without fixed roles or expectations. So the professor here tells students where the classroom is. They come, and they take their seats, and they're waiting for the professor to exercise positional authority and tell them what's going on. And they sit there and they look around. And the professor doesn't tell them what they're supposed to do. The class itself becomes a living experiment. And the students are both observers and participants in this experiment. Who takes initiative? Who follows? Who stands aside and just observes? What factions begin to form? Perhaps people are like, why are we even here? Let's just leave. What roles do people play? How do they handle conflict? How do they set goals, either individually or for a collective? Who makes decisions? How do they deal with uncertainty? What dynamics emerge related to race or gender or age or economic status before they became master students, or whether they transferred in from community college? What makes certain people more influential than others? What makes certain people more vulnerable? How does this evolve over the course of a class or over the course of the course itself? As people learn the rules, learn new rules, or try to establish and create new rules. The classroom becomes a social system to be experienced, to be interrogated, and analyzed. And eventually the TAs and the professor do take this laboratory and help to distill the lessons that students should be learning about the laboratory of a class. Most students will also have real-world client work on real-world policy and leadership challenges. And with their client, they'll be expected to develop their written and oral, and includes recently digital communication skills. In several of our classes, students will confront ethical dilemmas and wrestle with conflicting responsibilities or values. What trade-offs are they willing to make? How do they justify them? What are the likely consequences in these ethical dilemmas? Many students take a class called Psychology for Leadership. And among other topics, they investigate the power of changing the situation to change behavior. For example, my son may be more likely to eat vegetables if we don't stock quite so many potato chips in Pavilion 10. Maybe his dad too. Kids are less likely to smoke if they can't buy cigarettes at school. People may take less food at a buffet if the plates are smaller. Is it easier sometimes to change the environment than to change attitudes? And how might changing the environment, changing behavior, then change attitudes? We also expect students to develop skills of negotiation and advancing their interests in contexts of conflict, cooperation, competition. Negotiation is one of the topics that I've enjoyed teaching because students find it so valuable and applicable in all aspects of their lives. But I realize I'm getting old. I think this group, I can use this. Not that you're old, but one of the simulations that I've used for years refers to the Kelly Blue Book to find values of used cars. Students have no idea what I'm talking about. And even my exercise to simulate phone calls so that students have to communicate without any visual cues is thwarted oftentimes by FaceTime. And there are many more skills we work to teach, including decision-making under time pressure with imperfect information, the importance of human connection and relatability, the power and applicability of different mindsets. How might a growth mindset help a student to be resilient in a difficult situation? How might it help the community in which they're trying to exercise their leadership? How do they apply it with themselves, peers, clients, potential followers? And everything that we teach, which also distinguishes us from many other places that try to teach leadership, it's backed up by research, including original research by Batten faculty. My colleagues are some of the leading global experts on the dynamics of leadership trust and betrayal, for example, or the perception and response to a leader's public apology, or the ways that racial bias impacts choices, or the burdens of interracial interactions, or the rationality and irrationality of team decision-making, the behaviors that contribute to more effective lawmaking, getting more legislation passed. These are all topics of original research by Batten faculty, where we are among the top in the world doing it. And then on policy issues, on opioid deaths, to college access, to environmental regulation enforcement, and many more. Now, I don't have a catchy tagline for our approach to leadership. I know John Milton's trying to get me to get one, but still working on it. But it's evidence-based, policy-smart, humble, informed, pragmatic, service-oriented, solutions-focused. I don't have the language. And there are many useful frameworks for thinking about leadership. You may have heard of some of these: authentic leadership, adaptive leadership, primal leadership, born leadership, servant leadership, transformational leadership, situational or contingent leadership, path-goal theory. Really good contributions, and we want to expose students to all of those examples and more with a healthy dose of skepticism, humble skepticism. And most importantly, we want them to stay curious and questioning and to test things against their own experience. As a student, and I consider myself a student of leadership, I take on the same task to stay curious while remaining true to what I believe is most important. At the end of the day, my personal passion and our purpose as a school is not about leadership for the sake of leadership or policy for the sake of policy. I'm not interested in leadership for the sake of leadership. My vision for the Batten School is that our students will be motivated to serve a greater, larger, global good. They will have an orientation towards our common humanity. They will see themselves having responsibilities beyond just themselves and their organizations or their clients to consider the human whole. I'm not interested in leadership as a tactical exercise in just getting something done. To me, leadership is inextricably linked to service. And I like to say that love is what is at the heart of service, and service is what is at the heart of leadership. Service should also be at the heart of public policy. Is someone taking initiative to serve their community, or are they merely serving themselves and their appetite for power or advantage? I believe that serving others is what gives leadership its meaning and prevents it from becoming corrupt. And let me go one step further to suggest the real challenge is not simply the act of service, but serving the greater good. This was the lesson I took away from my time in South Africa observing Nelson Mandela. To address our epic challenges as a diverse and divided world, we need leadership that pulls people together rather than tears them apart. Leadership that heals the divide rather than aggravates it. The greater good asks, what is good for others too? What ensures that larger numbers of people are benefiting? Creating win-win solutions. Baking a larger metaphorical pie rather than just fighting over the size of your individual slice. Greater good leadership sees democracy as a collaborative joint venture rather than a cutthroat competition. It's about working with others, both those who agree and those who don't agree, to find solutions that consider the good of the whole. Greater good leadership is not only about outcomes, but also about the process and the relationship and the residual goodwill created through collaborative work. In fact, the leadership that really inspires me is a leadership that takes diverse groups of people who have competing and even conflicting values and mobilizes them to solve our epic human challenges like the ones we defined earlier. That will require that leaders have the courage to engage with ideas that they despise. Tell my students that if they are not outraged by something they hear during their time as students at Batten or at UVA, then we are failing to prepare them for the demands of leadership in a diverse and divided world. But we're not failing. We're doing exceedingly well. And most importantly, our students are thriving. The measure of our success over the long term will be the contributions of our students and alumni as leaders in the world. I'm very proud of our Batten graduates, including Malcolm Brogdon, as lifelong students of leadership, policy, public service. We're a young school, we're a small school, but we are rising to the moment with hope, with determination, with innovation. So thank you for giving me some time this morning. I appreciate your support and engagement. This is an extraordinary time to be at UVA with the Karsh Institute of Democracy and the New School of Data Science and the leadership commitment to confront our complicated history. I'm excited about Batten's future and feel extremely privileged to be the dean. So I leave you with this. What role will you choose to play in shaping our common future? How might you exercise leadership that serves the greater good from whatever position or non-position you occupy? What actions might you choose to take? And how might we work together? Our amazing students are ready to join with you. Thank you for listening, and I'd be delighted to take your questions. I think so, yes, microphones will come around to you. I saw that orange, I saw her first, but let's go to her first. Carlos, you had me all day yesterday on the board. We appreciate you. And you're here from Columbia, and that woman next. Great.
Thank you, Dean Solomon. It is. Test. 1, 2. You've opened up so many things that just beg a deep dive, but 2 things. One, that you're evidently special interest in mediation negotiation, and wondered what offerings are in the pipeline or currently in that regard. And also, it's my perception that interdisciplinary is quite a much more than a buzzword, but very much spreading throughout academia. And it seems like no one jumps into that arena more so than Batten, with borrowing from all these other disciplines. And on the other hand, with that great mission is my perception that universities are often very territorial, and the whole thing of what's this new school on the block, what place, how do we thread the needle of stepping on toes and bruising egos and missions. There's so many other things that are cross, like Institute of Environmental Negotiation, all these other things that are in different places. So any reflection on all of the above?
There's a lot there, but I appreciate it. I can grab you afterwards and we can keep talking. So the first about negotiation. The Batten School does have several very popular negotiation classes, and I'm frequently volunteering or being asked, or some combination, to go in and do short negotiation workshops for the Meriwether Lewis Institute and others. And that's when I realized that I need to update my Kelley Blue Book reference, or even buying a car and knowing that mileage is important. but but it is a big part of my personal approach to things. And we did receive many questions from people about, how in a polarized society with competing values, how do we prepare leaders to make choices or take sides? So thank you to whoever submitted that question. And I often recommend, with humility, I recommend a negotiation perspective to look at that, right? So what are some of the themes of a negotiation? Can we separate the people from the problem, right? Too often, our problem, and then the next step in negotiation, can we separate our interests from our position, right? What really matters as opposed to the flag we put in the ground, right? Can we look for options for mutual gain? Right? I was, the questions about taking sides. Maybe taking sides is actually the wrong way to think about it. Maybe it's think, what are our interests, and are there ways that we can find ways to solve? If I can help you solve your interests, you're more likely to help me solve mine. Right? So that's my orient. And then, is there objective criteria we can use? Now that's a hard one these days because there's so much dispute over facts. It's one of the and that's why universities are so critical to maintain our focus on evidence-based work and facts and standing up for truth and being willing to admit mistakes and failure and where we get it wrong. But you talked about some of the challenges also of interdisciplinarity within institutions. And you're right, it is at the heart of the Batten School design, but it's also difficult, particularly if getting tenure in my field requires me to walk this way, and getting tenure in your field requires you to walk that way. How do we find ways to walk together? And we haven't solved that perfectly. I think we have a good model and a great community, but it takes a lot of work. But it certainly is, if you look at the job descriptions for all the UVA deans who've been hired, and a funny fact is that there are 8 more hired since I've been here. Every single one emphasizes collaboration, working together. All the incentives that come from the provost and the president these days are for schools trying to do things beyond their silos. Doesn't make it all simple, but there's definitely a mood and a mode that is the wave of the future. Certainly it's the wave of Batten's future, and we have affiliates in many departments, but I think for higher ed as a whole. But there's work to do to figure that out. Thanks for the question. And then two rows behind you. Okay, Carlos, you stole it, but I am promising you next.
If it's perfectly with your previous question and about working together and negotiations and collaboration, at the crossroads of what's going on in democracies anywhere, in many places, obviously in the U.S. polarization is a fact that obviously spills over to many, many countries and many democracies. And I mentioned to you maybe last week in our Zoom meeting that we have a group in Colombia of very different viewpoints. We have sitting there with very rightist people, academics, former guerrilla members who had killed people on their lifetimes, put bombs. We're sitting together. Yes. No, I'll just keep on. So my question is, how could you elaborate on the process of having UVA with all those resources into splitting over into action to invite maybe those people who were at Charlesville downtown a few years ago to sit down with people who think in democracy, people who are very much on the left of the Democratic Party, and start talking.
Yeah, no, it's so I've done a fair amount of conflict resolution and efforts at facilitation and mediation, and one of the hardest things ever is to get people into the same room. I have a pretty high confidence if I can get people together, I'm not sure we can solve it over, but we can make progress. We can start a process of demonstrating a little bit of reciprocity towards getting some trust. If I can get them in the same room. So when I worked in India and Pakistan, the hardest thing was having a meeting. Right? And I don't have the solution. Sometimes the circumstances may not permit it. But there are a couple of things that are important, right? It's important to have institutions, and Batten wants to be one. I think UVA can be one that can be a convener and is seen as being a convener willing to bring people who disagree together, that wants to play the role as an objective, neutral entity to bring people together. The other thing is the importance, and sometimes they call it the third side, not the fourth side, or as we do but of outsiders who can nudge others to sit together, right? And the outsiders might be artists or musicians or the media or others, but can we get others to help in this problem? So it's not just the politicians themselves or the activists on the fringes. It's how do we get our religious organizations, our civic organizations, to be pushing towards to orient themselves towards greater good. It's really hard because these days, all of us, myself, I can get really angry and really partisan. But I know that's not the greater good, because at the end of the day, and I watched this with Mandela, a country that excludes all your opponents and enemies is not going to long be a country. Sorry, this side, you've gotten the raw deal on the hand raises here, but.
A bit of a follow-up to your question, but do you have dedicated requirements and coursework that help to teach these brilliant young people in your program to become social and political organizers and have direct experience within the community to become a successful organizer, like some of the leaders that we mentioned?
So we certainly have electives that are on advocacy and organization. It's not a required class on becoming a social organizer, but students with that interest can, and all students will have to choose a client to work with on an applied policy project, and they can choose an organization that's doing that to work with and work with the leadership there to develop that, but it's not a requirement. I do think the skills of organizing and the skills of influence and the skills of persuasion, the skills of understanding persistence and overcoming obstacles, I think those are transferable. One of the challenges we face, and this has been true since the school was founded and designed, right? We're kind of offering all the required classes that a traditional public policy degree might offer, and all the analysis and economics and research methods and data analysis, and we're putting on top of that a psychology for leadership. We're putting on top of that additional things around, right? So there's not that much room left. And I would love us to have, when we're trying to develop now, quicker ways for people to get pieces of this, even if they're not enrolled full-time for a degree, right? So lifelong learning opportunities like I guess this is, ways to come in for an hour or 2 hours, perhaps even pull up your phone for an hour or 2 hours and get some value from it, even if you're not enrolled full-time. Yes?
With the issue of good governance, such a problematic aspect around the world, can you imagine the leadership that is fostered by the Batten School having an organized way of addressing the governance in countries of this world toward good governance, perhaps through the United Nations?
So, and I think a version of this question was submitted, and I appreciate that. And whether it be a UN or other agency with the funds and the authority, perhaps, to promote better governance in the world. I want to play professor here, but we don't have the time, and say, well, right, and kick it back. We don't have time for that. So I do think, and I have experience from my World Bank days, where there can be pieces of it where you offer resources to countries that wish to take advantage of those resources on improving governance, on transparency of financial transactions, might be that you care about in the realm of governance, and offer it to those countries that want to take it. It's not clear to me that the UN at the moment or any of our multilateral organizations have sufficient clout or authority or even respect to really play that role right now. Could I imagine a scenario where UVA and the work of the Batten School, or the Batten School along with some others, develops some amazing training materials that's really compelling and professionally done, and that countries want to take advantage of our training materials? I can see that. You know, I did, before I came into this role, I did some training for the Bank of Ghana on leadership, right? Because they were quite interested, but they sought us out. I do hope that as we get more and more the word of what the Batten School is doing out into the world, and that's a real project for us. We're only 15 years old, but we have a lot of value to add, that we will have clients and students from around the world and perhaps other countries who want to send their ministries to Batten programs to learn certain things. So I think there's possibilities, but I see it more, I'm orienting more at this moment on an educational approach as opposed to kind of a government or UN imposed process there. Hopefully that's responsive. Okay.
Thank you. I have a quick question. Those who forget the past are doomed to repeat it. So
We may be doomed to repeat it anyway. But
exactly. So the idea, when your presentation, you showed the idea that you think things are bad, but you could look back in history and said there are situations that have been worse. What patterns are you seeing, or as you look back, if you said, look, one or two key patterns I'm seeing we're doing again, or is this really different than it's been in the past, as you think about what's going on in the world today?
Yeah. So we certainly have seen patterns of authoritarian behavior and authoritarian tendencies among our human species repeated throughout history, leading to authoritarian dictatorship and the failure of democracies. We've also seen periods of great democratic growth and enlightenment ideas, and right. So yes, there do seem to be patterns, but they're not perfect patterns. I do have a faith that we can evolve as a species. I think if you look at the grand history of human civilization, it's a lot, and there's been some great work done on this. A lot less murder now, a lot less rape now, a lot less subjugation. So we've made enormous progress as a species by educating more people, by feeding more people, by investing in science and knowledge, right? The opportunities. I mean, look at this room. Women were not at UVA 50 years ago, right? So we are making a lot of progress as a species, and we ought to be aware of that. But we've also seen these dark sides in our nature, and our tendencies to be really unbelievably, unfathomably cruel to each other at times. And I guess for me, there's nothing inevitable about either side. I go back to my South Africa. There was nothing inevitable about whether that country was going to descend into a race war or come out and be a non-racial democracy. There's nothing inevitable about whether this democracy we live in now is going to survive. That's why I want us to be investing in our students and our voters and our citizens and all those groups, from the American Petroleum Institute to corporations, to see, can we push us to be pushing towards a greater good? Because if it's all about patterns of selfishness, patterns of only caring about our race or our tribe or our party, then we may be doomed to repeat some of these failures. But this class of MPPs, they chose the Batten School because they want to be part of a different narrative, which is serving the greater good. And that's probably it. Thank you guys for joining today.
Thank you, Dean Solomon. On behalf of Lifetime Learning, we have a small gift of appreciation. Thank you for your talk today, and hopefully you all feel inspired. Enjoy the rest of your day and have fun at the game, and grab some duck donuts and coffee on your way out.